Howdy, Immortelium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing the two See No Evil movies. Now, I don't typically review two movies in the same video, but I feel like this is going to be a special case because I think it's impossible to talk about the second film without discussing the first one, and also I don't really think the first movie justifies its own video, and we'll go on to that in a little bit. But with regards to how I came to know about these movies, so I'd heard about the first See No Evil movie for quite a while, and mainly because of the fact that it was critically reviled. A lot of people really hated it. And because of that, I steered clear of it, despite my interest in horror. And while I'd heard that there was a sequel made to it, I didn't really pay it much attention. But that changed recently when I watched a movie called American Mary. American Mary was a movie that I really ended up loving a lot, and I became interested in knowing the people behind the film, the Soska sisters. And interestingly, I spotted, hang on now, they directed See No Evil 2. So I remember thinking to myself, well, if I'm going to see No Evil 2, because of the involvement of the Soska sisters, I'm going to probably need to see No Evil. So I was able to find both of them for pretty cheap, which is great. And I basically sat down to watching them, and here are my thoughts on them. Let's start off with the first film. So the first film, as you heard, was critically reviled, but I was still willing, to give it a shot and see, what it was like. The opening, as you can see here, immediately put me on guard because it just had this insanely cheap look to it. I'm always interested in trying to figure out why I think something looks cheap, and here I think it's a combination of cinematography and lighting. It just looks so cheap, and the weird thing is that from what I've heard, this was actually a pretty expensive slasher film. This was like about $7 million of a budget, and this is what it looks like. Anyway, so we're introduced to a serial killer called Jacob Goodnight, and his kind of trademark is that he takes the eyes out of people. Cut to a few years later after a messy police situation, and we meet one of the men involved in the opening who's now in charge of looking after prisoners. And these prisoners are being sent to a hotel, both a boy group and a girl group, and their job is to renovate the hotel. It's meant to be part of their community service, and they're apparently testing the idea of having this project be co-ed. And of course, as you might expect, Jacob Goodnight gets to show up and starts killing people. And that's the basic plot of the movie. The movie itself is pretty bad. I'm not gonna lie here. It's a very uninspired visual look. The characters themselves are very uninteresting, despite the fact that, potentially with the premise, having prisoners facing off against a serial killer, interesting concept, but one that is not executed well at all here. Several subplots are set up that have little to no payoff. The kills are unsatisfying, mainly due to a lot of use of CGI. And there's maybe one or two interesting kills, but that's really it. The others are very uninspired. The ending to the film was bad for multiple reasons. For one, a character kind of just, acted out of character from what he'd been acting like the whole movie, just so that there could be some survivors at the end of the movie. And this film also has one of the strangest mid-credits scenes that I've ever seen. It's completely pointless. It just simply adds to how tasteless this film is, and the only redeeming values that this film has, of which there are pretty much none. This is a bit of a stretch now, but the premise in theory is interesting, and the acting is okay-ish. It's not great, but it's not awful either. But besides that, it is a very, very bad substandard horror film, and it feels like WWE Studios, because that is the company that made this. They had a wrestler play the serial killer. I believe his stage name is Kane or something like that. But this just felt like a amateur attempt to set up their own slasher series in order to promote one of their wrestlers. So given all of that, you can imagine that I wasn't exactly looking forward to the second film. I was curious about it just because the Soska sisters were involved, but I was kind of wondering to myself, why did they even get involved in this in the first place? Turns out they're fans of wrestling, and they would actually make 2 films with WWE Studios. But I'm happy to say that See No Evil 2 is a startling improvement over the first film. Now it's not, brilliant by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, of the 3 films that I've seen from the Soska sisters so far, that being American Mary, Rabid, and See No Evil 2, See No Evil 2 is the weakest of them all, but it's still a staggering quality increase from the first film. So it's set right after the events of the first film. We are actually at a morgue, and they're responsible for bringing in, the victims as well as the killer's bodies from the massacre. While that's happening, a character played by Danielle Harris, it is her birthday, or at least it's close to it, and she was gonna go out and have some fun, but because of the massacre she has to work overtime, and her friends decide to come along and to have the birthday party at the morgue, which is simultaneously sweet and weird. And of course, as you can expect, it turns out that Jacob Goodnight is not dead. He is back and he wants to kill people. And that's the premise of the story. And you'd think from the premise of that it might be a very uninspired film, but the execution of it is where this really shines in many ways. Starting off with the style, you can see already that the film is much more visually interesting, far superior lighting, a lot more interesting cinematography. I'd have no idea what the budget was like relative to the first one, but regardless, See No Evil 2 looks like it has higher production values. Another thing that is fascinating about this film is that I actually enjoyed a lot of the characters. As I mentioned before, the first film, the characters were really uninteresting, really annoying, and in this film, none of them were annoying, only a couple of them were uninteresting. But the main character, played by Danielle Harris, is a very engaging protagonist, and her friends are wonderful in many ways. In particular, I have to give strong credit to Catherine Isabel in this movie, who is an absolute delight as this kind of eccentric friend of the main character. But I greatly enjoyed her screen time, and that applies to a lot of these characters. They're actually quite enjoyable to be around, which is, of course, fantastic as always. And the gore is actually quite an improvement. It's still not on the level of, say, like the old classics from Tom Savini or anything, but they are much more interesting kills, much more gruesome kills, and it just results in a much more enjoyable slasher film. Now, granted, it's not flawless, and interestingly, most of its problems are related to the first one. Of course, since the film is set right after the events of the first film, there's quite a few attempts to tie it in. And while a couple of them are okay, like for instance when they first hear about the massacre, there are a couple of other attempts to connect them that aren't as successful. I would also say that even though leading up to the ending there's some very clever kind of twists and turns and some nice plays on the horror formula, the actual conclusion of the film itself is quite unsatisfying. It feels very much like, oh, this is going to be another sequel. Of course, as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been another sequel, so it is quite disappointing from that perspective. But regardless, even though it is still quite a flawed and not amazing slasher film, it is very enjoyable, and it's crazy how much better it is than the first one. And I think it goes to show how talented the Soska sisters are, that they took something that was absolutely atrocious and they actually made a pretty enjoyable film out of the sequel. So in conclusion, what are my thoughts on these 2 films? Well, I mean, you already kind of know. The first one I really did not like. In fact, in many ways I hate it, because it's a very cynical feeling film, whereas the second film is far more enjoyable, far better executed. So I think ultimately what I'm saying is, unless you really want to know the backstory to Jacob Goodnight from the first film, just give the first film a skip. watch the second film. It's a much more interesting slasher film, and it's one that I'm very happy to have seen, particularly as a fan of the Soska sisters. So that was my review for both See No Evil and See No Evil 2, and of course, as always, I'll be incredibly interested to hear what you think of all of this. For instance, what are your thoughts on the two See No Evil movies? Did you like both of them, hate both of them, or, you know, like me, like one of them more than the other? What are your thoughts on WWE Studios when it comes to horror films? What do you think of the Soska sisters? And of course, if you have any additional information about See No Evil, about WWE Studios, about the Soska sisters, please leave them in the comments below. And of course, if you want to support the channel, I would encourage you to use my Amazon affiliate links in the description below. When you purchase Horror through those affiliate links, not only supporting me, not only supporting the channel, but you're also supporting the horror industry. So I'd highly encourage you to purchase your horror through those affiliate links. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.